Hello, and welcome to Footnote. I'm your host, Andrew Vanasse. The Forum Network is a conversation between someone with expertise and an audience of curious listeners.
Younger people would be more likely to get a meme, but aren't younger people, don't they tend to be more progressive otherwise?
You discuss the need, particularly for more localized and democratically integrated economies. So I'm just curious why you shy away from discussing socialism as a viable.
I just want to say that this system is so deeply rooted that it's hard to dismantle.
On this program, we expand the conversation to include someone else with exceptional insight into the subject. Thus, the footnote. Here's an example of what you'll hear. First, the original lecture.
Back when most people punch clocks at fixed hours, a date might have asked, "Shall I pick you up at 6?" But part-timers, contractors, and other contingent workers, who constitute some 40% of the American workforce, are more inclined to text one another, "You still up?" than to make plans in advance.
And then, a response from our guest commentator.
You know, I think that everything about our lives right now, right, is more about convenience and about what we can actually pull off in our lives. So when you talk about the concept of on demand, that's something that dating apps set up for us to begin with, this idea that we shouldn't have to even leave our houses to look for possible partners.
On this episode, we'll revisit a 2018 Cambridge Forum talk called Romance in the Information Age. How does love work in an age of browsers and smartphones? Does technology change the way we show affection for one another? Does a text message really replace a handwritten letter? In our fast-paced, always changing world, how can we pinpoint what love is, or how we show it? And now, on to our episode with producer Allison Armijo.
I wanted to jump right in with this idea that Northeastern University assistant professor and author Moira Weigel talks about, which is how technology and love interact and kind of shape each other.
If you want to understand why Netflix and chill has replaced dinner and a movie, you need to look at how people work. Today, people are constantly told that we must be flexible and adaptable in order to succeed. Is it surprising that these values are reshaping how many of us approach sex and love? Smartphones have altered expectations about when we are on and off, and working from home or from cafes has blurred the lines between labor and leisure.
To help me unpack this discussion and dig deeper into what it means to love in a digital age, I spoke with someone who's a relationship and love expert.
My name is Meredith Goldstein, and I'm the Boston Globe's Love Letters columnist, which means I'm an advice columnist for romantic and relationship issues. I also host the Love Letters podcast, which is a more narrative storytelling feature for us to get really in depth into people's narratives from their love lives. If you think about how technology has evolved even before the pandemic, it's kind of wild. I remember when I started the column, if someone had asked me, can I ask somebody out via text or break up with someone via text or, whatever, I would have been like, no, you can't do anything by text to start. Texts are for telling somebody you're going to be 15 minutes late. Well, 10 to 12 years later, I would say, wow, calling somebody seems really aggressive to ask them out for a first date. Like it's disruptive of someone's time. When somebody calls me, I think it's an emergency. The way we even take phone calls has just really tonally changed. So in the pandemic, though, one thing I found quite adorable is that people were really often trying to find ways to bond so creatively. There was that Modern Love column that discussed the questions you ask to fall in love with someone. And I cannot tell you how many people told me that they went on a Zoom date or a park date with someone and asked each other those questions. It suggested a different need for intimacy and the time and mental space to sort of play along with this idea that this could be romantic, that a sort of slow cooking way of falling in love could happen. And I just think, 2 months before the pandemic, so many people I know and column writers, it was so hourly and exactly like what Moira talks about everything feeling like work and transactional, because it's like, well, it's a $15 Uber to get to the restaurant, and then I have an hour, and then I got to go home and do more work. It was just so rushed. So my take on it is anything's okay as long as you can be present. And that word is used a lot, but to really be engaged with the person in front of you, which means that if a text brings you closer to somebody because it's an inside joke and you're really understanding someone, that's great. But if technology is overwhelming you with just a catalog of faces that you can't take any of them seriously, if technology is forcing you to say less of what's on your mind and more just, about speed, then it's not helping. So I just think I will never say that technology is a bad thing. It helps us find each other. It helps us talk to each other. It helped us stay together during this pandemic. But I think there's a difference between connection and communication and truly being present with someone. And I think that's what you have to ask yourself, which is if you can't concentrate on the date in front of you because of technology, it's not helping. But if it is getting you to the place where you can, then it is. And I have to constantly check in with myself about that in all parts of my life. Is this helping or is it actually pulling me away from humanity?
I think that's a good question, and I want to stay on that subject of the pandemic and humanity because I think how we express our humanity and our vulnerability and our love for one another has been so severely impacted by the time we're living in now, in pandemic times. During the forum lecture, Weigel talked about this too.
What's interesting when we think about both contemporary life and social history is that it usually gets articulated, this definition, in moments of crisis.
Right at the start of the pandemic, when lockdown was happening in the US, we were already seeing headlines about China and divorce rates spiking. And I wanted to look at, well, is this going to happen in the US? Are we going to see, and at that point, we didn't realize lockdown was going to be as long as it was or that the pandemic was going to stretch out in the way that it has. But what I was told by sociologists and psychologists is that when there is an event like this, and of course, there's been nothing quite like this in our lifetime, people do everything. So they do get divorced, but they also get married and they also have children. And this idea that they have been maybe pausing on big life choices, it just changes. The pause button is pressed again and everybody just goes.
And do you think age is a factor in the love-related decisions people are making now?
We had an episode of my podcast where we talked to a college student at Simmons who really felt like they were being old school and trying something completely out of the box by only meeting somebody in person. And of course, that was the only way to do it when I was younger. So I was like, wow, like they're going retro. But I think people do. And I definitely think setups happen. And I definitely think work relationships happen, even in workplaces that are defined by Zoom. So it's just about what you're open to. And I think that one of the nice things that app dating does do is let you know that this person is looking in some way. And often, especially in a city like Boston, you wind up, them 50 people anyway. The small town app dating situation or small city app dating is like, oh, well, actually, 6 of my friends. So the world actually can be pretty small. I would say one warning I always give to people when we talk about technology, it is a very different thing to talk about technology as a means to meet than technology as a means to display a relationship. And I think that if there is something troubling right now, especially when more of us are home than we used to be, it's the social media effect of how do we present our relationships? How do we present ourselves? Because we all become brands. And that is a little troubling to me. And maybe I'm just old, but I think it's something to be careful about.
Yeah, I really agree. And that reminds me because I was recently talking to my family and we were talking about dating apps and my parents just thought it was just bizarre that people didn't ask each other out anymore. And so we got into this big conversation about sometimes when you use technology, especially to seek out relationships, you don't really need to go the extra step of clarifying your intentions because, if you're on that app and that that's kind of what you're going for. So it's interesting how technology can kind of make those intentions known for you. I don't know if that's different or similar than if it would be in person.
I think it's actually the same. And I think back in the day, we always used to wish, my friends and I, like that somebody would have like a green light if they were interested in talking to somebody that night, at a bar. And this is sort of that, right? They're on the site, they're on the app. So that means there is somewhat of a green light, especially if they swipe right. And I remember having a friend who pre-marriage would always go up and talk to women in bars and post-divorce said, wow, this thing that I used to do that felt totally friendly now feels predatory and scary to people. And he said, I wouldn't just walk up to a woman. And there's also the safety issue, right? Of like, I don't know you, I can't Google you. And I think people are that much more reserved about meeting a stranger in person, not a setup or somebody at work, but just meeting somebody random at a place. And there are reasons for that, right? So I do think that it is much more similar to meeting at a party than people know, especially people who've been coupled for decades.
talking about being intentional with how we present ourselves online, this reminds me of something Moira Weigel says about how relationships are like unpaid internships. She approaches it more from the perspective of labor and its payoff, but I think it also says something about, how we present ourselves to potential employers, even potential partners.
The generation of Americans that came of age around the time of the 2008 financial crisis have been told constantly that we must be flexible and adaptable. Is it so surprising that we have turned into sexual freelancers? Many of us treat relationships like unpaid internships. We cannot expect them to lead to anything long-term, so we use them to get experience. If we look sharp, we might get a free lunch.
Meredith, what do you make of that?
One of the cool things I think about her writing and research is about this idea of labor and dating, right? And sort of how, one of the most common problems I've ever dealt with as a love advice columnist is people feeling as though they have dating fatigue. And that is because hour by hour, they're swiping and swiping and swiping, and it feels like a job. And I think dating has always felt like work, right? We're looking for a partner, and so much of partnership is rooted in the sharing of finances, in health insurance that we share. I mean, it's not cynical to say that these partnerships are based on economic structures, right? I am probably less cynical or more Pollyanna-ish about why we do what we do. And I do fundamentally believe that, especially as people get older, they are looking for good company, and that it isn't just an exchange of time for dinner. And that, but I do think that in the same way that a lot of younger people are saying, oh, well, unlike you, older generation, I'm not working for a company and getting some massive pension. I'm not necessarily getting a payoff for commitment to you forever. And therefore, I might want to freelance, or I might want to change my employer more frequently. We're asking the same questions of relationships. Like, why would I commit monogamously forever if this isn't about a financial structure? Is that what's healthiest for me? Is that what's healthiest for you? So I try to come at it without cynicism, but just to say, well, what if the old models of commitment don't work for the reasons why we do it? At some point, we were told the story that this is about love, and this is about enjoying somebody's company and sharing a life, and that it isn't about a dowry or some sort of financial exchange. And yet the models have not changed a lot, at least on paper. So I think that's interesting to see how the models change to fit what we're actually doing with love and partnership.
Yeah, I agree, especially just thinking about the pandemic. I mean, since most things moved online, it's kind of like we have the option to be everywhere or nowhere at once. And I think that can be really jarring.
Oh, yeah. And it's really difficult. A lot of my friends have kids who are teenagers at this point or slightly younger. And I know one very difficult thing was coming out or partially out of the original bubble we were in COVID. And some teens were allowed to go out and be indoors and do stuff, and others were not. And so that gap of who's allowed to do what and who might live with a high risk person, that divide felt even bigger. And I think the same goes for dating, right? And that's why I feel like we sort of all try to find someone who's having a similar experience, Not everybody loves Zoom dating, but it was something that I hoped and still hope will stick around. That the idea for somebody like me, going to an event, going to a dinner with somebody when I'm busy, I'm not going to be that present with them. But if I can just click on a link and talk to them and have a glass of wine at my kitchen table, I will be so engaged with that person. So it doesn't seem like Zoom should bring me closer to somebody, whether it's friend, family member, date, whatever, but it does, because I'm that type of person. So I just hope we all have empathy for each other's styles, that just because somebody doesn't show up in person for a first date doesn't mean they don't want to be there. If anything, it could mean that they want to be that much more involved.
I know I'm only 20, but I would agree that I don't think there are hard boundaries of like how you can express love in certain times or across certain mediums. I think, to return to that idea of technology we talked about, technology can make things like dates more convenient. Meredith, what factors do you think are important in considering technology as that medium to express love?
So there's a group at MIT that thinks a lot about robots, actually, and they think about technology and all sorts of things. And this is at the MIT Media Lab. And one thing, a scientist whose name is escaping me, and I'll find it, but she always asks, does it help you thrive? and thriving. What a word, right? And I would say, is it additive, right? That, like, is this a part of your life that's making it better? And the answer might be sometimes and sometimes not. And I would really encourage anybody to say, what about this feels bad? What about this feels like an obligation? What about this feels joyful? What about this helps me connect? And you can kind of see these patterns. Well, if being on a dating app for 2 hours a night makes you feel like dating is hopeless, but being on for 15 minutes feels like a blip, and then you go on with your day, be on it for less time. I think there's a huge fear of missing out that exists because of social media and dating apps. Like, if you're not on it for 20 more minutes, you won't see that soulmate of a person. And unfortunately, we can't live life that way. We can't be everywhere at once. You wouldn't be able to be at every bar at once, in the year 1995. So I think it's being kinder to ourselves about what are the choices we make to be the best person we can and the happiest person we can, because that's when we might attract someone who likes that version of us.
I like that idea that love is more ubiquitous than we give it credit for. Meredith Goldstein, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Boston Globe columnist and host of the Love Letters podcast, Meredith Goldstein. Footnote is written and produced by Allison Armijo, Frederique Rigoulot, Dave Goodman, and me, Andrew Vanasse. Annie Shreffler is our executive producer. Footnote is a project of the GBH Forum Network. We're grateful to the Lowell Institute for their generous financial support of this program and our ongoing efforts to document big ideas and bring them to you. Our website address is forum-network.org. There you will find the full 2018 presentation of Romance in the Information Age, as well as many other informative and entertaining lectures. We hope you'll come back for another episode of Footnote. Thanks for spending time with us.